Welcome to Royal History UK, where the past comes alive.
Imagine this scenario for a second. You wake up in the morning and you realize your rent is higher than it was last year. Your weekly grocery run, noticeably more expensive. Electricity, heating, putting petrol in the car. Literally everything just feels heavier on your wallet. But your salary? Well, your salary just isn't climbing at that same speed, is it? It's a feeling so many people are experiencing right now. And it brings up a really crucial, kind of confusing question. If the news keeps telling us things are stabilizing, why doesn't it feel like that in our own bank accounts? Today, we're going to unpack exactly what is happening to the UK economy. In this explainer, we'll look right past the headlines and figure out why the expectation of economic recovery is clashing so incredibly hard with the reality of our daily lives. To really understand the true picture here, we need a roadmap. So we're going to systematically examine these 6 key pillars. First, the overarching economic paradox. Then we'll break down GDP, look at inflation and interest rates, analyze jobs and productivity, tackle the very real government debt challenge, and finally, deliver a balanced final verdict.
All right, let's jump right into section 1, the economic paradox, or macro numbers versus micro realities.
So the crucial point we absolutely have to start with is this central mystery. What is actually happening to the UK economy? Like, is Britain's economy truly recovering, or are the official numbers just completely disconnected from an average family's everyday experience? Because here's the shocking part that trips a lot of us up. A country can technically experience economic growth on paper, while millions of its people genuinely feel poorer.
And this right here beautifully illustrates exactly why that happens. On paper, you've got the macroeconomic data ticking upward. GDP might be rising, inflation is technically falling, maybe rate cuts are on the horizon, or the stock market's having a great day. But contrast that with real life. Sky-high rent, stagnant wages, lower purchasing power. Look, if your income's purchasing power is dropping, it simply doesn't matter what the GDP spreadsheet says. You are not going to feel like the economy is strong. Grasping this exact disconnect is the single most important takeaway of our explainer today. To really feel the weight of this, we need just a tiny bit of context. Britain was once one of the most powerful economic forces on the entire planet. London was the undisputed center of global finance. British companies did massive business in every corner of the globe, and a super strong pound sterling was a dominant currency in international trade. Establishing this history is important because it creates a really sharp contrast with a very different economic reality and the intense struggles the country is facing today. Let's move to our first major metric in section 2. GDP, growth versus pace. Basically, is the economy growing fast enough?
So, gross domestic product, or GDP, basically measures how many goods and services an economy is producing. Normally, if GDP grows, great. It means the economy is expanding. But the UK's major problem right now isn't necessarily that it's not growing. The problem is that the growth is incredibly slow. It's crawling. And slow growth creates this nasty ripple effect. It restricts businesses from expanding, it makes investment weak, it makes improving productivity super difficult, and most importantly for us, it puts heavy pressure on long-term wages. So a growing economy doesn't automatically mean a prosperous economy if the pace is moving like a turtle.
Which brings us to section 3, inflation and interest rates. Let's explain the true cost of living.
Let's use a very simple analogy to frame how inflation really works, because it can be tricky. Imagine your weekly grocery bill used to be $100. Over time, as prices increased, that exact same basket of food went up to $110. Now, you turn on the news and the anchor says, "Great news! Inflation has dropped." A lot of people subconsciously think, "Awesome, my bill is going back down to $100. But it won't. It stays at $110. Those high prices, they're locked in. This is why we need to clearly define what something like 2% inflation actually means in the real world. When inflation drops to 2%, it does not mean prices have dropped. No way. It simply means that prices are still increasing, just at a slower rate. The absolute level of prices and the rate of inflation are two totally entirely different things. That's exactly why households rightfully say, "Hey, the data says inflation is down, but I still feel the squeeze at the checkout counter." They aren't contradicting the data at all. They're just living the reality of it. And this directly builds into interest rates. When a central bank, like the Bank of England, wants to control that inflation, they trigger a very deliberate chain reaction. Step 1, they raise interest rates. Step 2, borrowing suddenly gets way more expensive. Mortgages, business loans, consumer credit, it all costs more. Step 3, because borrowing is so expensive, people spend less and the economy cools down. And finally, step 4, that cooling effect helps drop the inflation rate.
But here is the catch that a lot of people miss. Rate cuts do not instantly fix the economy.
Monetary policy travels slowly, like molasses. If a family had to renew their mortgage while rates were at their absolute peak, their financial pressure doesn't just magically disappear the day the central bank announces a slight rate cut. They're locked into that higher cost for a while. The actual relief? That takes a long time to reach the household level.
Let's shift our focus over to the labor market in Section 4. Jobs and productivity struggles. Are we working harder but not smarter?
Look, to understand the real strength of any economy, you have to look at employment. When employment is strong, a fantastic domino effect takes hold. Businesses are hiring, people are earning, wages are improving, and therefore household spending remains really strong. On the flip side, if unemployment rises or businesses just slow down their hiring, intense economic pressure builds rapidly. However, and this is a big however, strong employment and a truly strong economy aren't always the exact same thing, which leads us to a massive invisible hurdle.
That hurdle is productivity. Productivity is basically defined as the amount of economic output produced from the same amount of workers and the same amount of time. If a country's productivity is slow or stagnant, long-term economic growth is severely limited. Think about it. You can have absolutely everyone working, but if they aren't producing more value per hour than they were a decade ago, wages will stubbornly refuse to rise. This is widely considered one of the major, completely misunderstood structural challenges holding the UK back right now.
Next, we have to look at how the state manages all of this. Section 5. The Government Debt Challenge, or borrowing to survive. Mechanically speaking, when a government cannot fully cover its spending with the tax revenue it brings in, it borrows money. Now, debt itself isn't automatically a terrible thing. Almost every single major economy has it. The structural strain happens when the debt gets so high that the interest payments alone start consuming a massive portion of the national budget. When you're just paying off interest, it immediately reduces your flexibility to fund the essential public services, things like hospitals, infrastructure, and education.
Which leaves policymakers facing this incredibly difficult central dilemma. How can the government support growth, maybe through investments or tax relief, without making the national debt problem even worse? It is a total tightrope walk. You need to spend money to generate growth, but you don't have the money to spend because you're busy paying off debt. It's an intense structural strain on the state, regardless of who happens to be in charge politically. So, bringing all these pillars together, we finally reach Section 6, the final verdict. When you look at everything, is the UK economy ultimately strong or weak?
The reality is a wonderfully complicated, balanced picture. Looking at the strengths, the UK is far from a collapsed economy. It remains one of the major developed economies in the world. London is still an extremely important global finance hub. It has incredibly strong institutions, world-class universities, and top-tier global businesses. But those weaknesses are severe structural problems. Slow productivity, weak overall growth, incredibly high living costs, immense pressure on the housing market, and heavy government debt.
So if we had to distill this entire analysis down into one core conclusion, it would absolutely be this. The UK economy is not collapsing, but it is struggling to generate strong, sustainable growth. It's not a disaster movie by any means, but it is a deep, frustrating struggle for meaningful upward momentum.
And you know, we really have to remember, beneath all the GDP charts and inflation percentages, this is ultimately a story about people. It's the reality of an ordinary family trying to balance a grocery budget. It's the young person trying to scrape together enough just to buy their first home amidst insane housing pressure. It's the local business owner wanting to expand but feeling totally squeezed by interest rates. It is the worker who just wants their salary to actually make their life a little bit better year over year.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, the big question isn't really, is the UK economy growing? Technically, yeah, it might be. The real provocative question we all need to be asking ourselves, the true measure of economic success, is this. Is it growing fast enough to actually make people's lives better? Because until the macro numbers translate into micro realities, the struggle will continue to be felt. Think about that as you watch the headlines this week. Thanks for joining me, and keep questioning the numbers.